for a biennial convention. And of course, we're talking about issues and looking at the issues that affect seniors and retirees. And one of the major concerns today would be the effects of the sequestration. It's something that, first of all, it's a big word. Most people don't understand exactly how it's going to affect them. It's going to take place over a few months, so we may not see the exact effect immediately, but we're certain that given the cuts that are going to be in line for various programs, almost every retiree will be affected in some way before the end of the year, end of the calendar year, not necessarily the budget year. They may have just started feeling the impact of the sequester on health care, public safety, and cuts to critical programs and services. If you think about it, without the low-income home energy assistance program, many seniors will not be able to pay their heating bills. Without transportation services, getting them to tasks like doctors and shopping and picking up prescriptions may not happen, or they'll face severe hardship. It's difficult today, even with those programs in place, to make some of those arrangements, and to be cutting the cost of those and cutting the amount of services available is going to make it that much more difficult. When you look at sequestration, we hear about cuts to Social Security, not to the Social Security payments, but to the offices themselves. And what does that mean? That we're going to close the offices a part of the time. And this is a time when the Social Security program has a backlog of applications for Social Security benefits, for the health care benefits, for disability benefits, and to cut office hours for those types of programs seems to me to be unconscionable. When we look at the home heating program and the health care programs, it's most of us kind of forget about the fact that, well, we can still get around, we can still get places, but there are thousands, tens of thousands of seniors in Wisconsin that rely on transportation programs because they don't have family near where they live, they're very elderly, and to get to a doctor or to get their prescriptions, they need that transportation. It's time for, in our opinion, it's time for Washington to get off the dime and not try to balance the budget on the backs of seniors and retirees, and actually on the backs of working people. The families that built this country, the politicians didn't build this country, the working families built this country. And right now, we're not being served by what's going on in Washington with the sequestration. The fact that a few hundred representatives in Congress and about 100 senators can't get together and come up with a bipartisan agreement to fund the needs of this country into the future, it just seems to be unbelievable in this day and age. But that's where we stand. Any questions?
So are there any budget things you guys would endorse? I mean, do you have any interest in moving back the retirement age, anything like that? I mean, at some point, some things need to be cut. So everybody says, not us, the other guy. So what are the solutions?
Well, I can tell you one thing. First of all, and you people in the media seem to be in love with the word entitlements. And you can't say the words Social Security and Medicare without saying them together as though it's the same program. Social Security as a program has nothing to do with the deficit or the debt. It didn't add a single dime. It's a separate program. The accounting, it's an accounting measure that President Johnson added to the budget during the Vietnam War to make it look like the war wasn't costing so much. So they added the dollars in Social Security to the federal dollars to make it look like, hey, we're doing all right. Medicare, on the other hand, does need some adjustments. And those adjustments need to be made perhaps in the way we deal with health care here. If health care in the United States was dealt with the way it's done in every other advanced country in the world, our cost would be about half of what they are today. And if that half was put in context of the federal budget, we would not have a deficit. So the fact remains is health care definitely needs to be looked at. When you look at the cost of health care, insurance companies, the administrative costs are somewhere between 25 and 30%. This has been demonstrated over and over by actual actuarial studies that were done here in Wisconsin, for instance, a few years ago during the Healthy Wisconsin debate. And so the idea that we can just make the cuts without doing anything about the way the program is, or the way the health care is handled today flies in the face of reality. When you look at what cuts will do, we've got a perfect example of what cuts did. We've got a historical example, and we got an example right today. A historical example is President Roosevelt, during coming back from the Depression, did the cuts, did the let's cut cost on everything, and it extended the Depression time for another 5 or 6 years. Actually, it was the war that finally brought things back. Today, we see the same thing happening in Europe with those countries that are under the euro. The fact that they're cutting and doing this, we've got to be austere, has actually raised the unemployment in almost every country. It has raised the cost of doing business for the government because the interest that they on their borrowing has increased. And we see it today, in fact, if you looked at the news this morning in Cyprus, where for $13 billion, $13 billion in the United States is, they probably lose that in cab fare from one department in Washington to the other on a given day. For $13 billion, Cyprus was going to put a tax on savings accounts, on accounts in the banks. They're having demonstrations, demonstrations in the streets, bank run, all because of austerity, because the people in the euro are causing it. And you say, well, why is that important? One of the things we hear regularly is, you know, we're going to be like Greece. We will never be like Greece. Greece is stuck because they're in the euro. We have our own monetary system. We can adjust the monetary system up and down. We've done it hundreds of times over the last couple hundred years, and that can address these kind of things. But the idea that we'll just cut Medicare and cut Social Security and cut these programs is going to save this country flies in the face of reality.
But isn't that the issue? Whenever somebody tries to bring up ideas for fixing them, as you would say, then somebody stands up and says, well, that's a horrible idea, blah, blah, blah. And then we get where we are here, which is these sequester cuts, which were supposed to be the cliff that we wouldn't walk off of. But nobody is allowed to do anything because advocacy groups such as yourself get in the way of any kind of reform.
I have some suggestions. Let's talk about Social Security. Social Security uses an actuarial report that looks out 75 years, which no other retirement type program does. No other program looks that far. Most of the time, 35 or 40 years is about as far as you can legitimately look. They use 3 possibilities for growth of the economy, which decides whether there's going to be enough money. Because they're actuaries, they use the middle one. There's a high, low, and middle. They use the middle growth, which is a little under 2% growth per year adjusted for inflation. What they get is, if you look at the last 75 years, we've mirrored the upper level, which is a few tenths of a percent higher. It doesn't sound like much, but when you're talking trillions of dollars, a few tenths is a lot of money. If they just use that, this so-called problem with Social Security would go away. But let's say that they're actually right in their using the middle one. First of all, they could do away with the cap on Social Security, the $110,100 it was last year, which means if you make more than that, there is no Social Security withheld. They could, if in fact they felt they had to raise money, they could raise 0.1%. It amounts to about 1%. So over the next 20 years, because the trust fund is good till 2037 under today's actuarial report, they could add 0.1% increase on each side to the amount withheld over a 10-year period. It would be almost unnoticeable compared to the 2% we just added back on January 1st. And that would fill about 65% of the Social Security, this perceived loss. On the Medicare side, I think that the big part would be look at how health care is delivered here. And that's a bigger question than what are we going to do about Medicare. That's a question about health care in this country. When you talk about the voucher plan in Medicare, it seemed like, wow, that's a great idea. We'll just get people to pay more. The problem with the voucher plan is it was going to be tied to a cost of living index that we have relied on for a long, long time. Unfortunately, the cost of health care has increased almost twice the rate that cost of living index has increased, because the cost of living index that everybody uses doesn't take health care into consideration. So we've watched the cost of health care go sky high and really done nothing about it.
Do you pin the responsibility for the sequester on any particular party?
No, I'll be honest with you. No, I don't. I think that it's a a reflection on the inability of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, to go there to do what they were supposed to do. Right now in Washington, where we have, it must be the water. It's got to be the water there because we have that in some states, unfortunately. We have ideology, not political reality, running the show. It's a real shame that we are paying these people, what's $172,000, $174,000 a year to go to Washington and do nothing, and that's what they're doing.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Leon, how do you pronounce your last name?